Hi everybody. Now would be a great time for us to get started at high noon Canberra time. So before we get into the event, I'd like to recognise the traditional owners of the lands that we're on as we connect today. And I recognise we're not all meeting in a single place. For me, I'm on Ngunnawal land here in Canberra, and I acknowledge the Ngunnawal elders, both past and present, and pay my respects to traditional owners here and around the world. Many other folks will be on the lands of other nations, of which there are very many in Australia. It's important that we take time to reflect of whose lands we're living on as we have these conversations, as we move through the world in our lives. And for the sake of our international listeners, because I know one of the benefits of these online events is that we do reach an international audience, is that here in Australia, we make these acknowledgements because in this country, First Nations never ceded sovereignty of their lands, and we have no treaty. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So this event is run by the Australian National University Climate Change Institute. Because of this digital world that we're in, there's a really great back catalogue of other events that the Climate Change Institute have run in the past as well. And so these include both in-person events in the pre-COVID era and more digital events in the current era. So I encourage you to look those up if you enjoy what we're doing today. They cover a wide range of themes. You can access them through the Climate Change website, Climate Change Institute website, I should say, climate.anu.edu.au. My name's Beck. I'm a lecturer in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University and a member of the Climate Change Institute. At the ANU, I'm co-convener along with Professor Jamie Pittock of the Master of Climate Change program. I'm a social scientist, so I'm interested in the social dimension of issues like climate change and disputes over environmental issues, energy change. I tend to focus my research on Australia and actually use psychological theoretical tools, though not clinical psychology as we'll focus on today, but social psychology to make sense of the complexities of the social world and how they interact with issues like climate change. I'm the moderator of the discussion today, so you won't actually hear all that much from me. But we're going to be exploring the question, how do we stay actively engaged on climate change and avoid emotional burnout? I suspect that you've all thought long and hard about why we might need to ask this question, so I won't give you a spiel on why it's important, but we're going to get some excellent insights from our two exceptional speakers. So we have Dr. Bronwyn Gresham, who is a clinical psychologist with Compassionate Nature, and Dr. Susie Burke, who is a senior psychologist with the Australian Psychological Society. After their presentations, which will be 10 to 12 minutes each approximately, we'll dive into a bit of Q&A and discussion. So I'll introduce both Dr. Gresham and Dr. Burke before their presentations, and we'll start with Dr. Gresham today. But also please share your questions with us. It's a really excellent opportunity to get wonderful insights from Dr. Gresham and Dr. Burke on this issue of maintaining our emotional well-being. Because we're doing this whole Zoom webinar thing, it would be ideal if you can use the Q&A function. You can chat in the chat, but we won't necessarily be able to pick out some themes there to dive into in the Q&A. So please use that Q&A space. I think you should also have the ability to indicate if other questions that have been asked are the sorts of things you'd like to hear. So maybe you can vote them up or press a love heart or something like that. But it's also useful to keep in mind that this is a sensitive topic that we're discussing. So please be sensitive and sensible and respectful if you're using the chat and also in the questions that you ask. Please ask many questions. We want a rich discussion, and that really is up to you. But do be mindful of the nature of the topic that we're dealing with today. And I understand that Lamise from the Climate Change Institute is also going to be sharing some resources via the Zoom chat function. So if this conversation has made you recognize that you might like more help or more resources, they would be really useful places to start. I might have said before we're starting with Dr. Gresham, I think I've reversed our order and we're beginning with Susie Burke. I'm imagining I might get a nod from the digital world at some point. But how about we go straight to Susie? So Dr. Susie Burke is a senior psychologist with the Australian Psychological Society. In this role, Dr. Burke explores ways of using psychological knowledge to enhance community well-being and promote social justice. Dr. Burke is in the psychology and the public interest team, which is a concept that gets me very excited. And in this team, she examines the absolutely critical question of the role that psychology can play in helping us understand the causes, impacts, and solutions to climate change, but also other environmental threats. So that includes natural disasters, which of course are of major significance to our species and the world. Dr. Burke has published a great deal of material across these themes, and much of that is available to the public. So without any more from me, I think we can go to Dr. Burke. So there she is. Thank you. Please unmute yourself, Dr. Burke, and it'll be great to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Beck, for that introduction. I just need to make a correction. I don't actually still work at the Australian Psychological Society anymore, so I'm sorry that I hadn't corrected that. But much of the work that I will be talking about today is from the work that I did in the public interest team at the Australian Psychological Society. I'm just going to share my screen, so just bear with me while I have a little fiddle. And I'm going to go to there. Now, can you see my screen? Could anybody see that? I couldn't hear anything.
We've got it now, Dr. Burke, thank you.
Okay, so you can now see my screen. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
There was this terrible silence. I thought, oh dear, I've lost everybody at ANU and all around the world. Thank you very much for inviting myself and Bronwyn to come and talk to you today. This is one of our favourite topics, talking about climate change and how to cope with some of the emotional stresses and strains of it. And I'm going to start off first, talk about for about 10 minutes, and then Bron is going to follow on from me. I thought I'd start off though with a First Dog on the Moon cartoon. I can't read that so well there, but because I have part of my screen up. Climate change is not only destroying the planet, but our psyches. Those of us without brain parasites are being ground down by climate despair. Are we losing the will to fight? Is it all just too hard? Now, I wanted to show this slide because First Dog's got a great knack of pointing out the obvious, but it's also a little bit unspeakable. And we know that climate change does indeed, provoke a whole range of really uncomfortable and distressing and painful feelings for people. And to follow the science on climate change is often to be terrified. This is something, it's one of the reasons why we're here today. But here's another First Dog on the Moon. After decades, we non-scientists are still wandering about in climate shock, filled with rage and grief. There's nowhere to take these feelings. There's no one who can say, I've been there, it'll be okay. Because climate change is killing the planet. Your therapist lives on as well. Oh my God, we are doomed. I told you so. So I just thought that was a nice one to sort of follow up with, because what we're going to talk about today is what First Dog and the rest of us can actually do with our rage and grief. And in fact, it's not true that there isn't anybody to talk about it with. And we're not doomed to wander about in climate shock. I mean, not only would that be most miserable, it would actually also be enormously unhelpful. There's a planet to protect, there's lives to nurture, and there's a planet of species to thrive. So Bron and I are a couple of therapists, we're psychologists, and we're going to talk as psychologists, but also as academics and activists and mothers today, and share some insights into strategies that people can use to help to deal with some of these feelings. So in the work that I had been doing for many, many years at the Australian Psychological Society, we were looking at the importance of knowing how the climate crisis affects us psychologically. And it's actually profoundly important for us to know this, not only because it involves, deep and difficult feelings that have an impact on how we are in ourselves and how we are in our work and family and in our lives, but also the way in which we are thinking and feeling about climate change can actually result in us acting in a whole lot of unhelpful ways. We can switch off, we can minimize the threat, we can put all our faith in somebody else or silver bullet solutions and things like that. So for that reason, it's actually enormously important for us to be able to manage the big feelings that come up about climate change so that we can stay engaged. And a few years ago, Bron and I collaborated with the Australian Conservation Foundation and the Climate Reality Project, and we put out a couple of handouts, which I'd be very happy to share with people. One on dealing with burnout around working on environmental issues, and the other on coping with climate change distress. And so what we're going to talk about comes from some of this material. And the other resource that I just thought I would share with you was this piece of work that I produced when I was working at the Australian Psychological Society called the Climate Change Empowerment Handbook. And in this, what I and my colleagues did was looked at decades and decades of research in social science and psychology around how to what is it that we've learned about the psychology of climate change, how it impacts us, how we affect it through our human behaviour, and what we can actually do about it. And from that emerged these 8 psychological strategies that are written up here in this Activate, or the Climate Change Empowerment Handbook. So Activate is an acronym for these 8 psychological strategies. So I won't be talking about them today, but I will be drawing on some of them today in what I go on and talk about. So what Ron and I did in that thing that we produced for ACF was we looked at these 4 different coping strategies. And I'm going to talk about the top 2, behavioural, the things that we can do to help us cope with the distressing feelings, and cognitive, the ways in which we can use our thinking to help us cope. And Ron's going to look at the emotional, the ways in which we can work with emotions, and relational, the ways in which we can use our relationships to help us cope with the distress of climate change. So to start off with, this was the summary of a few of the strategies, and there are many, of the things that we can do, the behavioural strategies that we can do to help us manage distress. So one of them, of course, is taking action. And we always talk about action as being, the best antidote to despair. This is one of my favourite ones. I've been cultivating a trend over the last few years of family holidays involving taking my children on environmental protest camps. For me, action has always been a great way of being able to manage distressing feelings around climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next couple of slides. But another one of the important things to bear in mind is the importance of taking a break, that actually keeping up with a constant stream of information about climate change doesn't actually solve the climate change problem. And it actually takes a huge psychological toll to be continuously exposing ourselves to this sort of chronic, intangible global environmental stressor, which is a good way of understanding the climate crisis. So, taking a break can mean turning off the 24/7 news feed. And I mean, the same people will be finding that they're doing with the daily COVID tally, that sometimes you don't need to know every single day what the latest figures are. These things do have an enormous emotional impact, and we can protect ourselves from them. So another one of the things that comes through the literature is the importance of having fun. Researchers have found that people who feel good are more willing to look directly at threats. So when you're talking about something as big as climate change, if we're feeling good, then we're better actually able to look at the threat, we're better at negotiating, we're better able to come up with creative, novel and effective solutions to problems, all of which sounds incredibly important for the problem of climate change. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment as well too. Maintaining healthy routines is one of the standard things that we always are, encouraging people to do, and that's something that we've all become either really good at or really mindful of the importance of, even if we're not quite good at it yet, through the various, degrees of lockdown that we've been in all around the world. And the last one is in this list is to focus on only a few issues. Working on too many climate projects can be unwieldy and it can be overwhelming. And if you can focus, it will lower your stress levels, and specialisation is a really good behavioural strategy for coping. There's this psychologist, a risk psychologist called Paul Slovic, who I heard speak at a psychology conference many, many years ago, but he was interviewed in George Marshall's book, Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. And Paul Slovic talks a lot about genocide and, these enormous big global problems. And he's a risk specialist, so he understands how people appraise and interpret risks. And of course, in climate change, it's really important for us to understand how is it that to what extent are people seeing that climate change is a risk that threatens us? Because the extent to which we see that it's a personal and salient and relevant risk will have an impact on, how actively we try to do something about it. And so, Paul Slovic, leading expert in these sorts of issues, and I'm sure I read somewhere that George Marcel had said to him that he wished that he could get Paul Slovic to, you know, move over and come and work on climate change. And Paul's answer to that was that, you know, he makes a point of only working on one wicked problem from hell at a time. So I've always remembered that as a way of, you know, remembering that focusing on only a few issues can actually be a really good thing to do. And what we find in the research too is that when people have a combination of, you know, a project in their local community that's about, you know, connecting often with the, you know, land care groups or, you know, issues in your local community, that plus projects that a project or you know, a few selected projects that are about global political change is a great combination for sort of a well-lived, you know, life of activism and engagement in the climate threat. So this is a picture that I often use when I'm talking about the importance of action, and this is actually my daughter, who was one of the little kids in Castlemaine who were one of the first to follow Greta's lead and begin the school strikes in Castlemaine. And you can actually see, I just love this slide because you can see what fun they're having out there, skipping school on a school strike, surrounded by, you know, thousands and thousands of children all through the streets and all over the world, that it actually is a really positive, engaging thing. And I think it's a lovely picture to consider when we think about the impact that climate change and this COVID situation is having on young people at the moment. So this is a slide that I often use when I'm talking about group efficacy, the importance of doing things in groups, and the belief that, that when we work together in a group, we can actually make a difference is enormously important. So, and the other slide that I just wanted to show in talking about behaviour and the things that we can do is this little grab of the front page of a website that has been built by Robin Gulliver. So you picture of her there, Activism Research Hub. So she's just finished her PhD where she looked at environmental collective action in Australia over the last many years. And she looked at in detail at the work of 83 climate change advocacy groups and did detailed analyses of 58 campaigns to gauge their success. And I just wanted to show you this website because I think it's got some terrific resources for people who are wanting to use, you know, activism and action as a means of being able to cope with climate stress. And one of the things that she found was that, you know, large number of the groups and the actions that people were doing achieved success within 24 months, and that campaigns targeting businesses actually achieved the highest rates of success. I thought that was really a very interesting finding. But the other finding that came out when she was looking at what were the criteria that really influenced the success of groups' actions, it was things, of course, like time and committed volunteers and resources and all those sorts of things. But then there was this social psychological factor as well, which was having positive, emotional and joyful connections with the other colleagues that they were working with, which was a real key element that the people that she interviewed were saying were, you know, a signifier of their success, of the success of their campaigns as well, which I thought was worth sharing with you. Okay, so then the next bit is the ways in which we can use our thinking. So the cognitive strategies that we can use to manage our distress. So dropping the judgments and the shoulds and the assumptions. I mean, working on climate change is hard enough without also beating ourselves up for, I shouldn't have said that, I should have done that differently. Oh, when I had that argument with somebody on the street about, you know, blah, blah, really was a, you know, the amount of mental energy that we use quite effortlessly often to beat ourselves up about things that we should and shouldn't have done is not necessarily helpful. So being mindful of that. And then there are also the importance of balancing action with reflection. So, you know, not always being busy, but taking time to sit back and go, are the things that I'm doing actually strategic? Am I putting my efforts into things that give me best bang for my buck in terms of, you know, emission reduction potential? That's quite a good measure of the usefulness of the effort that you put into doing things. And then restoring ourselves mentally and cultivating hope. So I've got a couple more slides just on that, so I'll move on to that. This is a slide that I use when I'm lecturing about the importance of engaging with nature. And I thought I'd use this for restoring ourselves mentally. This is when I'm talking about forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku, which is what the Japanese call it. I was reading a paper the other day that was published in 2010, which I think was one of the earlier academic studies looking at the stress-reducing benefits of being in a in a natural environment. And they had this experimental and a control group, and the experimental group had to go to a forest 3 consecutive days, spend 2 hours there, walk about 2.5 kilometers, not particularly far. Second day, they had to do that twice a day. Third day, they had to do it twice a day. And the control group got to do exactly the same thing, but they got to wander around a beautiful city in Japan called Nagoya. And then they compared stress levels in stress measures in people's blood and urine before the experiment, and then after, and then even a month later. And what they found in the 2 groups was that the control group, absolutely no difference. It didn't affect your stress levels at all to be walking around for 3 days in a row around this beautiful city in Japan. But the group that went out into nature had reduced levels of stress hormones in their urine and increased number and activity of natural killer cells that were a marker in their blood, and increased presence of anti-cancer proteins in their blood. So it had this stress reducing and immune boosting impact, this forest bathing. So that's one that I found myself talking a lot about with people at the moment, particularly when everybody's lives have been enormously disrupted and everybody's walking around with a lot of stress at the moment. And then the very last thing, and I'll just zip through this one, was the cultivation of hope. And I quite like this slide as well. In spite of everything, Mildred still believed it was a wonderful world. I think you've got the wrong Mildred. Well, I always use that slide to lead into my next slide, which is maybe Mildred just had a different type of hope. And this chap here, Per Epson Stoknes, who's a Norwegian environmental psychologist, he talks about there being these 4 different types of hope, and one of them's actually more useful than the other 3. So he's got passive optimism, which is Pollyanna hope. Oh, it's going to be all right. We don't really need to do much about it. It will work out all right in the end. And active optimism, which is heroic hope. We can make it happen. But both of them require you to actually have a fairly optimistic outlook, and it's quite hard to it's quite hard to make a good case for optimism at the moment. And so then he offers these other 2 versions: passive skepticism, so a bit skeptical about things turning out all right, but we'll weather the storm. This is the type of hope that we often have when we use extreme weather events as a proxy for climate change. So, oh well, we've had terrible disasters before and it's awful, and but we can rebuild. We know how to handle this. That's also not particularly useful type of hope, because it's a little bit resigning ourselves to what's going to happen. The other one is active skepticism, or grounded hope, or active hope. And the features of this are grounded in reality, accepts that the situation is bleak, skeptical about it turning out okay, but we're still choosing to go for it anyway, to work towards a better planet because it's the right thing to do, and standing by is unacceptable. So I'm just going to go to the last slide, but not spend much time on this, but you can just have a look at it. And if anybody gets a copy of the slides later, you can then have all of this there. And then I'm going to hand over to Bron. So Bron, you can turn your video on now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the slides up, and I'm going to turn my video off and make myself go quiet, but I'm still going to drive things. So I'll just be cued by you, and you tell me when you want me to move on to the next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Burke. That was such an enriching presentation, and I feel like we could listen to you for hours and hours on this. I'm also impressed by the feat of coordination that this will be in cooperatively managing the slides. So before we hear from Dr. Gresham, I'll just give a brief introduction so you know who you're hearing from. So Dr. Bronwyn Gresham is founder and clinical psychologist at Compassionate Nature. She's trained in and done research on therapeutic ways to deal with trauma, personality, mental health conditions, and common life challenges like loss and grief, so common to many people. She practices therapeutic skills that are focused on mindfulness, emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, crisis management, and living through values and self-compassion. Dr. Gresham has worked for RMIT as a senior advisor for mental wellbeing. And in this capacity, she contributed to the development of the RMIT Wellbeing Strategic Action Plan, which I understand is in place now in 2020. When could we possibly need it more? Maybe the future. The organisation that she founded, Compassionate Nature, focuses on self-care for caregivers. And this is caregivers of people, of animals and nature, and healthcare professionals. So it'll be wonderful to hear some more from Dr. Gresham. Go ahead, thank you.
Thank you so much, Beck. And never before have I been called doctor so many times, except by my mother. So I'm just, you know, soaking it in since that. So thank you. It's a beautiful introduction. And thank you so much, Susie, for setting the scene and for speaking to those cognitive and behavioral strategies, which obviously, you know, if we begin to influence one of those areas, it does trickle down and influence other areas. So even though we're speaking of them separately to really increase our literacy and skill sets, just knowing that if you focus in on one area, that it will impact our emotions and our behaviors, etc. So I'd just like to begin before setting the scene of the emotional landscape, just to acknowledge the unceded physical landscape that I am speaking to you all on, the land of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders. And I noticed that there was a really beautiful question in our comments that hopefully we'll get to in the moderation, in the discussion after this, from Julie around the Indigenous perspectives, because it's something that you know, I've certainly, along with many people, been turning my mind and heart to, really beginning to understand various different knowledge processes and knowledge sharing and concepts of deep time and all these things that I think will really benefit us as we grapple with the climate emergency that we're in. So my intention here today is really actually to share some of the learnings and experiences that I've had through volunteering with a group called Psychology for a Safe Climate, because that's where I've really had the opportunity to channel this anxiety and fear and grief that I've felt around climate change and channel it into something that matches my other passion in life around psychology and self-care and compassion. So although my day job is actually at RMIT as the senior wellbeing advisor there for staff and students, and I do clinical practice through my Compassionate Nature business, it's Psychology for a Safe Climate that I currently do a lot of this work around and thinking around climate change, and it's certainly been a lot of learning through that group. So Bob Doppelt, an author from the US, who I'm a big fan of, says we are in collective recovery from the separation of nature. And I would even imagine that some of us aren't yet in recovery from the separation of nature. Some of us are just beginning to reawaken or remember, and that we are intricately connected to the natural world and indeed a part of. And I sense that this shifting consciousness from the mindset of individualism and consumption and objectification towards a more conscious, systems-oriented worldview is what brings this ever-expanding repertoire of emotional experiences, especially as another favourite author of mine, Sally Gillespie, puts it, when the norms of contemporary lifestyles conflict with developing ecological sensitivities. And I wonder if that's how, you know, you on the line also get caught up in, when we really connect with our ecologically sensitive side, when we realize that everything we do, everything that we consume, everything that we purchase, every way that we relate does ultimately have an impact on the world around us for generations to come. So with this, it does bring different emotions, and I loved it when Sally said it provokes unspeakable emotions, really, these deep, really deep, painful emotions around terror and fear and grief and loss. And some people are beginning to actually recognize these as connected to our normal everyday literacy around emotions, but beginning to recognize the difference. So we're beginning to hear words like eco-anxiety and ecological grief and solastalgia, which is that homesickness that you feel when you're not at home, when the landscape around you has been radically changed due to human impacts. And these words are there not to pathologize the experience, but to legitimize that our feelings connected to land and connected to the non-human world are warranted and real and valid. As Graham Lawton, who's an author, I think with The New Scientist, I should have looked that up, he said, We could say that the outbreak of climate anxiety is not an outbreak of mental illness, but represents a long overdue outbreak of sanity, a sign that we're alive and responsive to our context. So parallel to this, these challenging emotions, in my experience, what I'm noticing also is this incremental rise and attention to systems worldview and systems thinking, a focus on mental health and well-being, a focus on self-care, collective care, and empathy and compassion practices. I really do see that there's this over the past decade in particular, shifting rise in more and more people being willing to speak to their emotional sides, being willing to prioritize emotional health as just as important as physical health, and not just individual health, but collective health. So I'm, I guess, really keen to have this conversation today and see where we go, and thought we would share a few of the emotional strategies that have been found to effective in general, not just around the environment, but I guess in particular now more than ever, we need to remember and remind ourselves that we have these inner resources available to us, and they're skills that we can learn and strengthen as well. So the first skill I've got there is taking notice, just actually acknowledging when we're experiencing or when eco-anxiety or grief shows up in our world. And this may be really obvious, like in response to the bushfires that we experienced earlier this year, and feeling a sense of horror or grief or shock through either directly experiencing or even witnessing. Or it could be more subtle, like when it shows up when you're in the shopping centre and you see all of your vegetables covered in plastic, and you instantly feel irritated and rage at all of this waste. So the first step is just really beginning to take notice and to really acknowledge when these emotions show up, and putting words on the experience. We know as psychologists that there's this phrase, what you name, you can tame. There's something about, you know, when we begin to put language in words, we activate this frontal part of our brains that begins to help us regulate then our emotions and what we can do with those emotions. And you know, in parallel to that, there's this what we feel we can heal. So the more we actually invite these emotions in that spirit, the more capacity we have to choose what we do with them. So I've got validation and understanding function as being the second skill. And so validation basically says how I'm feeling makes absolutely perfect sense, given the context, given the situation, given my history. As opposed to saying, I shouldn't feel this, I'm too sensitive, I'm being silly, I'm being, you know, a leftist hippie caring that the tree next door got chopped down, I shouldn't care about that. You know, that's dismissing, that's minimizing and denying the reality that we are connected to nature. And the functional part is recognizing that and trusting that every single emotion we have inherently has a function connected, a function to motivate us to act, to communicate to others, or to validate that what we're experiencing is real and needed and warranted. So really getting good at validating and appreciating the function of our emotions can really help us then do what's needed, which is discern when that emotional experience is really helping me or harming me, whether it's helpful or hindering. So I just wanted to share some quotes from some authors. Margaret Klein-Solomon is a psychologist from the US who's written a really great self-help book that I would highly recommend. And she shares a good chapter in that book on the various emotions connected to the ecological crisis that we find ourselves in. In relation to fear, she says, "My fear is a constant presence in my chest and stomach. I'm afraid for myself and my family, and even more for the world as a whole. But my fear has become my greatest motivator, urging me on." And in speaking about the function of ecological grief, Joanna Macy, again, an absolute legend in our field, reflects when we feel this emotion of grief, we know not only that the loss is real, but also that it matters to us. That's the digestion phase, where the awareness sinks to a deeper place within us so that we can take in what it means. And that speaks to that the process of grief is when we, of course, feel sadness and despair or loss about losing something or someone or some place. But the process of grief also invites in a re-evaluating and a reconnecting with meaning and purpose. So the third step is really tending to our needs. And this is really getting good at discerning when I'm in an emotional state, when it's showing up, is this going to help me or is this going to hinder me? And so this requires us knowing what our goals are in that moment. Is my goal to do X or Y? And is this emotional state going to propel me and support me in that? Or is it going to get in the way? So examples of when it might get in the way is when an emotion leads me to avoid everyone and everything, or to drop out of the things that matter to me, or to keep me up at night. And in this sense, we need to begin to tend to our needs. So the more we listen to our emotion, the more we'll be able to get a sense of what we might need. And in psychology, we have skills that, upregulate us, that we might need to be energized or awakened or motivated, or there are skills that deregulate, that soothe the system, that calm our nervous system, that create a bit of anchoring and groundedness. And there's different skill sets within there that you might be thinking of, things that you do to stay calm and grounded, for instance, like going for a walk, like being in nature, like saying calming, reassuring thoughts to yourself. And the fourth set is, I've put in there, is around harvesting and really thinking about how we can generate positive emotion states, like love, which is very powerful. Mark Coleman, the author of Awake in a Wild, says, the more our hearts love this beautiful earth and everything within it, the more we feel the pain of the life that is currently being harmed on this planet. Though this experience is sometimes difficult to bear, it has a purpose. Our love can help kindle the necessary fire within to protect that which we hold most dear. And indeed, Glenn Albrecht, who came up with the term solastalgia, he's a philosopher based in Newcastle, has a book called Earth Emotions, begins to really articulate all these other positive earth emotions like some biology, the love of living together. So speaking of together, this brings us to relationships. Maybe next slide, Susie. And Susie's already spoken a lot about the benefits of being in a group and having that positive engagement with others. So I won't speak too much about this. But suffice to say that this really essentially is tapping into a core psychological need around connection, which is essential for our sense of safety and efficacy and flourishing. So this is us embodying a systems worldview that recognizes that my well-being impacts your well-being and your well-being impacts my well-being. The well-being of the earth impacts the well-being of us. So it's very relational and interconnected. And in some ways, what I've found is remembering that we're in this together can ease that strain or stress that I feel around that cognitive dissonance when I face the climate emergency and how big it is, and I realize the limits of my individual agency. That really can cause so much despair and burnout, because it means that we're never enough, we can never do enough, there's always more to do. That's a very individualized mindset. So remembering that we're a system working together means that if I take a break, like if I take a breath in a choir, the music continues. There's permission to rest and digest, because that's essential for sustained action. So again, Sally Gillespie, I love her writing. She reminds us that cultivating this systemic worldview that links individual behaviours to collective action can ease the burdens of feeling individually responsible for saving the planet every time we go to the shops. At the same time, it can cultivate hope every time we make choices that consciously connect individual action to systemic processes. So I've got here some ideas around, and these are again referred to in the booklet that Susie and I are sharing today. sharing our concerns and values with our loved ones, with our friends, our family, our colleagues. You know, muddling through these conversations together will helps us, and I'm sure you'll know this, you know, helps us remember that we don't have to have all the answers, that we are really in this together. Social time and social bonding. Susie's already mentioned the importance of having fun and being creative and efficient. Mentorship to really tease through these things, having lots of spaces where we can feel heard and work through our own process so that we can contribute, continue contributing and giving back. And belonging to a group. Best thing I did was join Psychology for a Safe Climate, and before that, you know, involved with Environment Victoria, with the ACF, with the Al Gore Climate Reality Project. I've joined that many groups over the years. It really helps you feel, not just know intellectually that we're all in together, but feel it on a deeper level. So it's incredibly helpful. And I think at this point, it's 22, so I've just looked at the time. I might stop talking and yeah, I'd love to read. I haven't had a chance to look at all the Q&A in the chat, but love to hear how everyone's going.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gresham. I was going to call you Bron then, but I'll stick to the doctor.
Please call me Bron.
Okay. But thank you both. This has been so enriching, and we can see in the comments and in the chat just how many people are really valuing the wonderful insights that you're sharing. Thank you both very much. Before we get into the questions, I thought I might just let everyone know we're going to run for just under another 25 minutes. So we'll be wrapping up at 5 minutes to the hour. We'll get through the questions that we can, but there's some really rich perspectives coming through. And I should say they're coming through from an audience, a live audience of just about 200 people. And no doubt there'll be folks watching this later on. So inevitably, we won't cover all the ground that we could. So please also use that thumbs up option to help guide us through the questions that you'd like us to talk to. Now, I might start with what we've got at the top here. It's one of the questions that came through that Bron mentioned that she was eager to engage with, and can see that a lot of others have said the same thing. So Julie Rickwood has written in and said, Aboriginal perspectives on climate change are unique. In a recent publication, Barawak Country 2020, they said, and in quotes, humans are not the new gods to make and unmake and save the planet single-handed. Rather, they are in relationship, beings who must respond to, respond with, respond as more than human beings, with the places that, after all, do not stand separate from us. And so the question that Julie has followed this beautiful quote up with is, how might those perspectives help us to think differently about the effects of climate change? So if it's okay, I might go to you first, Bron, and then Susie, if you would comment after Bron has spoken, that would be wonderful.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks, Julie, for that question. It's something that definitely over the last year I've become much more proactive in a lot more reading around Indigenous perspectives, and certainly finding in particular just the different ways of knowledge sharing, from written to, of course, more verbal and narrative and story, and also the concepts of time, how, you know, it's not linear, it's you know, and there's deep time, and this you know, if we cared as much for the generations in 100 years time as we do for the people who are alive now, we might be finding ourselves in a much more rapid transition, acting on climate change. I'm actually not sure how those perspectives help us to think differently about the effects of climate change. I don't feel immersed enough in the Indigenous perspectives to make a particular comment about the effects of climate change, but and maybe Susie, you've got something that you might like to add there, or perhaps even Julie might like to speak to that a little bit. Something that I'm still learning.
Yes, I'd quite like to hear from Julie as well, if she's got something to share. It is something that we're all still learning. Bron and I are on a WhatsApp group, and there's been much sharing of resources recently on Indigenous perspectives on climate change and what we can learn from it. So, you know, we are very much in the learning phase of that. One thing that I was struck by, though, when I was reading your question was, you know, a warning that David Suzuki issued years and years ago. I'm sure it was him who said, when he heard about this proposal to bring Komodo dragons to Australia to deal with the rabbit problem, which was, you know, just stop doing these things that, you know, these big things that you think are trying to rectify other problems. You know, we're just not good at thinking through the consequences. And if everybody could just stop doing these things. So I'm butchering what it was, but it's just always stuck in my mind. And in a way, that's sort of what you're saying then, that, you know, we're in relationship with the natural world, and we need to be finding ways of being very responsive to that, rather than just bringing in these top-down responses as well. And one of the things that I've been struck by, because I've been sort of quite involved in watching the school strike movement developing, I've been so impressed by how much that's been putting Indigenous voices front and centre, and how much the young people have been you know, invited into that particular way of thinking about the things that we do and the impact that we have in Australia.
Thank you both very much. Now, I've been scanning through the Q&A, and I'm going to try to synthesize 3 questions. So questions from Maddie Braddon, Hedda Ransom Cooper, and an anonymous, I wonder who's behind the anonymous account, who've all asked questions around the theme of starting up groups. So how do we foster collective efficacy? How do we set up groups that might help us to deal with eco-anxiety? And are there particular topics that are especially useful to mobilize around, for example, activism around energy or other themes? Would you have comments around these ideas? So maybe I'll go to Susie first on this one, and then over to Bron.
Yes, I've always got ideas about this. So several years ago, 2 environmental psychologists in America wrote this paper, which was around, you know, working out what actions you're doing that give you best bang for your buck. And what they were looking at was the importance of, you know, emission reductions as being one of the criteria for the usefulness of particular tasks. And because we can only be involved in so many things at once, and because we need to be selective and strategic about our things, it is a really good question at the very beginning of starting a group or working out where to place yourself into a group is, well, what's going to be A, the most effective group, and B, that they're not really in any order. Where am I going to actually find that I'm working with people that I trust and that I really have a good, fun time with? So when I was, you know, thinking about this and working with some friends in my town of Castlemaine, and thinking about what would be a group that we could come up with, we decided that perhaps the most strategic use of our time was to teach people how to get arrested by standing up for what they believe in, to fight, you know, for pro-environmental progress. And so we started a direct action non-violence group, and we trained people in direct, you know, non-violent direct action. And yes, because we were thinking, okay, well, yeah, we really sat back and thought, what's the biggest thing that we could that we can do with ourselves? And, you know, personally, I think it's, you know, bringing about, you know, political change and that big movement stuff. So, and, you know, if you've got a group of people that you can have these joyful and positive emotional connections, going on that research by Robin Gulliver, that's an enormously holding thing as well. So over to you, Bron.
Thanks, Susie. It's such a great question, and it's kind of twofold, isn't it? So like Susie's spoken to the, you know, how do I choose which group to, you know, that I can best contribute with, or I feel most alive and connected to, that will bring me the most sense of meaning and purpose, because let's face it, that's really intrinsically motivating to keep going. The other thing is, like, how do we instill psychological safety and well-being, like a trauma-informed lens, into our groups, no matter what they're focused on? So I think that's an important conversation. And I know I started reading some of the XR content around the regenerative culture, and I think they've got some really good resources there to guide that thinking. And then the third option is joining a group that is focused on specifically speaking to, venting, sharing our thoughts and feelings around the engaging with the climate emergency. So a few come to mind if you don't want to self-create one, are things like empathy cafes that are being run more increasingly, and also the Good Grief program, which is a US-based it's a peer-to-peer program, so you don't have to be a psychologist or counselor or expert in emotional health and well-being. In fact, it's better that you're not to run those. But so it's particularly for just any human being, and it's really well tested now over the past kind of couple of years. They've really refined their model, and it's a 10-step kind of peer-to-peer approach that you could pick up, copy, paste, implement in a small group.
Thank you both very much. It's very nice as well to see the amount of comments coming in the chat. Something that came through so strongly here is to remember that we're not all going through this alone, to support each other. And we're seeing that in practice, which is so nice. Now, it would be terribly inappropriate if I don't go with the democratic wishes and put to you the question that came through from Lois Wishart. So the question is, how do we deal productively with years of increasing frustration and rage against the federal government's climate change denial, including the latest gas-led recovery, it's in quotation marks, pronouncements, and the overwhelming influence of fossil fuel companies, while scientists and medical experts are ignored? Then in parentheses at the end, not to mention fury and despair at the escalating destruction of the natural world, extinctions, etc., as well as land clearing, logging, et al., continuing apace. So what I take from that is it's a question about how do we deal with our emotional response to climate change in addition to our emotional response to institutional responses to climate change. Maybe just for the sake of alternating, Bron, it would be wonderful if you answer first and then hand over to Susie.
Sure. I guess want to begin by acknowledging that, yes, this is what we're feeling. And like that, just that intense, deep rage, grief, despair, like this is real. This is the emotion that you're meant to feel when the action that's commensurate to the problem is being blocked or being denied or being continuously toned down. So that we, when you're facing climate reality, you see that the solution being currently offered is not adequate, and that's deeply frustrating. I think some of the skills that we're talking to today are warranted, that it's beginning to think, this is so context specific, so individual specific, but really getting to know whether that emotion and that moment when it kind of surfaces up, how that's fostering and supporting you, or if it's hindering and eroding, your creativity, your innovativeness, your energy. If it's depleting, then that's when we begin to think of, okay, well, what do I need to call up or put in that's going to be nourishing, supportive, and create resilience for me, so I can grow through this, make some meaning and sense of it, so that I can stay engaged and activated. Because we need that fire of the anger. Anger tells us that there's been a moral injustice or a practical or ethical or corrupt, something's gone wrong that's against our core being, and that compels us to do something about it. So there's an element of anger and distaste and disgust that compels us to keep righting those wrongs. And at the end of the day, when we're about to go to bed, that's when we don't, we would never tell our 5-year-old children or our teenagers to ruminate on these things and go to bed really angry, fostering all of that rage. We would invite them to focus on what they appreciate about the world, what helps them feel anchored and calm, so that it invites in some opportunity to rest and restore what we need to do when we're going to sleep. So it's beginning to really see the complexity in these emotions and get to know your own landscape and what you might need. and thinking about the context of whether you're going into a march or whether you're going into a politician or whether you're having dinner with your partner or you're about to go for a walk in nature.
I love doing things together with Bron, because she'll always say awesomely clever, sensible things like that. And that means that I can then do the rah-rah part of it as well. So thank you very much, Bron. Well, I mean, when you were first reading out the question, I was thinking, yeah, well, first of all, you had to vote them out, don't you? And Bron, do you remember earlier in the year when we were allowed out into the world, we were all crammed close, very close together in a room listening to Margaret Klein-Sullivan talking. She is the woman who wrote the Facing the Climate Emergency, or whatever it's called, that wonderful book that Bron was talking about. And a young man in the audience said to her, you know, I feel disillusioned. I'm wondering if I should be dropping out of uni and, you know, just being a climate activist instead. And I really don't know what's the best thing to do. And I remember her saying, oh, you know, it's really important to live your life. I think she said that a bit. That's what Bob Brown always says to the young people as well, because I've listened to him a lot talking to the young people. You know, and it's really important to go to uni and live your life and, you know, have a career and all of that. But she said, but if you were in America at the moment, I'd be saying, well, if you were thinking of taking a year off, this is the year to take off. This was pre-COVID, you know, and get involved in, you know, the Bernie Sanders campaign at the time when it was before he'd pulled out. And, you know, so that's around using the political process. So turning that rage at what the inadequate response from the current government is into, you know, some political activism campaigning. So I remember that. Now, the other thing that I was listening to, I was listening to Dan Andrews in July on the radio, and he said, and I went and grabbed my notebook and I shall read from it. He said, it's very dangerous not to follow the advice of our health experts. It's not something I've ever done or ever will do. And I thought, well, great. We're going to use that because the health experts are saying it's absolutely critically important that we don't invest in this gas infrastructure rollout, which will just have devastating consequences for climate change. We need to be, you know, moving quickly to a rapid transition to a zero carbon economy and those sorts of things. And there's the last little story that I'll tell is what I heard from a mother the other day. It was on a mother blog, and Bron, I think it might have come from something that you'd shared. And she was saying that as a mother with small children, she was finding, you know, having to be really clever about how she was finding ways of being politically active, you know, talking about climate change with everybody, campaigning, always getting her message across. And Anthony Albanese many years ago said he knew that you know, climate change was a huge problem, but until people were stopping him on the corner and talking to him about what they wanted, and he was hearing from them, his phone was ringing hot, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And so this woman had said that when she was feeling really tired and stressed and the children were all underfoot, what she would do is she had a list of numbers on her telephone which were on auto dial. And it was politicians that she knew wouldn't answer the phone. So it would go to their voicemail. And so when she only had a little bit of time, she'd just ring the ones where she could just leave a little short, snappy voice message and give her opinion, rather than have to deal with their secretary, be polite, you know, all of that. And I thought, oh, that is so awesome. I was so surprised. I didn't think it was going to be that. I thought she'd probably say, oh, you know, I'll go and dig in the garden or something. But no, it was just, I'll ring the ones that are on speed dial who I know won't answer the phone. I can just leave a message. It was very clever. It was very inspiring. So, yeah, see how I can say those sorts of things, because Bron will say these other gorgeous things about how you have to, you know, look after your emotions and everything.
Thank you both. It's a wonderful demonstration of the power of being together in these sorts of things, the benefits that we get from working together. Now, we've come to the end of our allocated time, which makes me sad because this has been so enriching and there's so much more that we could learn from hearing from Dr. Gresham and Dr. Burke. But I'd like to thank our two speakers for joining us today. You've shared such extraordinarily valuable insights, and we can see from the chat, the Q&A, that it's deeply appreciated by many of the people listening. Also, I'd like to thank the ANU Climate Change Institute who organised this webinar, who organised lots of wonderful webinars, and that will be following up with sharing a recording of the event. I believe they'll be sharing the slides and also linking to many of the resources that are here. So also appreciation to the human beings that are the Climate Change Institute. So particularly Lamise, Claire, Juliet, Ruth, who have been doing the kind of mechanical work getting this going. Of course, Mac Howden, Steve Crimp and others in the team. So thank you, everybody. I think this is always the strangeness of being in the digital world. We're just going to turn our screens off and disappear. We can't applause, but maybe we can all stomp our feet and we'll feel the rumbles through the planet to show our appreciation. Thank you both very much, and goodbye, everyone.